On the morning of June 14th, 1658, on a strip of sand dunes north of Dunkirk, two French generals arranged their armies for battle. Henri de la Tour d'Auvergne, Vicomte de Turenne, commanded the French royal forces, reinforced by 6,000 English veterans of Cromwell's new model army. Facing him, on the Spanish side, stood Louis II de Bourbon, Prince of Condé, a man who had been Turenne's comrade, then his rival, then his enemy, and who was now commanding the left wing of an army fighting under the flag of Spain against his own country. Both men were 50 years old. Both had spent their entire adult lives at war, often alongside each other. Between them lay the question that the Fronde had been asking for a decade and that the dunes of Dunkirk were about to answer. Which of them was the better general and which of them had chosen the right side? The battle lasted 2 hours. Turenne won. Condé retreated in good order, having charged 3 times against the French cavalry in a fight he already knew was lost, covering a Spanish collapse he had predicted and been unable to prevent. Within a year, the war between France and Spain was over. Within 3 years, Condé was back in Paris, pardoned by Louis XIV, and restored to his rank, the treason of the Fronde officially forgotten by a king who needed his best commanders intact. The story of Turenne and Condé is not a story about enemies. It is a story about what happens when two men who are equally brilliant, equally ambitious, and equally indispensable end up on opposite sides of a political crisis neither of them fully chose, and how the decade they spent trying to destroy each other shaped France more profoundly than any of the battles they had won together. Henri de la Tour d'Auvergne was born in 1611, the second son of the Duc de Bourbon and Elizabeth of Nassau, daughter of William the Silent, founder of the Dutch Republic. His lineage was Protestant, aristocratic, and military on every branch. His uncles commanded Dutch armies. His father held the Principality of Sedan as an effectively independent sovereign. From childhood, Turenne understood that military command was both a profession and a birthright, and that the two things required different qualities. The birthright was given. The profession had to be learned. He learned it systematically, beginning as a volunteer in his uncle Frederick Henry's Dutch army at 18, absorbing the Dutch methods of siege warfare, logistics, and the patient management of campaigns against fortified positions that would become the foundation of his mature style. By the time he entered French royal service in 1630, Turenne had the technical education that most French noble officers simply never received, because French military culture in the early 17th century still rewarded boldness and family connection more reliably than preparation and craft. The result was a general who moved carefully, prepared obsessively, and rarely attacked unless the position already favored him. His enemies learned that fighting Turenne was like wrestling water. He was never quite where you expected him to be, and by the time you found him, he had already arranged the ground to his advantage. Louis II de Bourbon came from a different world entirely. Born in 1621, the son of the Prince of Condé and first Prince of the Blood after the royal family itself, he was as close to the throne as a man could be without sitting on it. He received his education at the Académie Royale and then at the Jesuit College in Bourges, where he apparently spent more time on mathematics and natural philosophy than on the courtly arts expected of a prince, a fact that would matter later, when his tactical intuitions turned out to be grounded in a genuinely analytical mind, rather than mere audacity. He was made Duke of Enghien on his majority and given command of the Army of Picardy in 1643, at 21 years old, in a war that France had been fighting for 8 years and was not yet winning. 5 days after he took command, he won the Battle of Rocroi. Rocroi is worth understanding in full, because it established everything that contemporaries believed about Condé for the next 30 years. The Spanish army of Flanders, with its famous tercios, the deep, disciplined infantry formations that had dominated European battlefields for a century, was besieging the town of Rocroi on the French border. Condé attacked immediately before waiting for reinforcements that might or might not arrive. His cavalry broke the Spanish horse on the flanks. Then he turned his horsemen inward, surrounding the Spanish infantry in the center. The tercios formed squares and held. Spanish infantry held in squares was as fearsome a defensive formation as the 17th century produced, and Condé charged them 3 times before they broke, the tertio discipline finally overwhelmed by cavalry attacking from all directions at once. Of 18,000 Spanish infantry engaged, 8,000 were killed and 7,000 captured. Spanish casualties were 21,000 out of 27,000 men. The Spanish never again fielded infantry of that quality. Condé was 21 years old. The victory at Rocroi did not just make his reputation, it remade France's sense of what was militarily possible, and it made the prince into something the French court had not previously had to manage, a military genius who was also a prince of the blood, which meant a man whose family connections to the throne made his ambition inherently political, whether he wanted it to be or not. Turenne and Condé first fought alongside each other in the German campaigns of 1644 and 1645, when Condé, as the senior prince, took nominal command of the combined French armies in which Turenne led the army of Germany. The arrangement was awkward in protocol and effective in practice. Condé's energy and instinct for the decisive attack complemented Turenne's patience and his mastery of logistics and position. Together they fought Freiburg, Nördlingen, and the campaigns that wore down the imperial armies until the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. The men who would spend a decade trying to ruin each other first learned their trade in the same battles. The Fronde began in 1648 as a tax revolt by the Paris Parlement and became within months something considerably more dangerous, a coalition of aristocratic grievances, municipal anger, and personal ambition that threatened to undo the centralization of royal power that Richelieu had spent his career constructing. The name came from the Fronde, the slingshot used by Parisian street boys to break windows, an image the rebels adopted with the self-conscious irony of men who knew they were being compared to children throwing stones at authority and didn't entirely object to the comparison. Both Turenne and Condé were pulled into the Fronde, though from different directions and for different reasons. Condé, having suppressed the First Fronde on Mazarin's behalf, found himself at odds with the cardinal in ways that combined personal grievance with genuine political principle. He believed he had not been adequately rewarded for his military service. He believed Mazarin was governing France badly, that the growing centralization of power in the first minister's hands was corrupting the political arrangements that the great nobility depended on. He was also, by multiple accounts, diplomatically impossible, imperious, contemptuous of those he considered beneath him in either birth or talent, unwilling to dissemble or negotiate when he could simply state his position and expect the world to adjust. Mazarin had him arrested in January 1650, along with his brother Conti and his brother-in-law Longueville, a move of breathtaking political audacity that simultaneously removed 3 of the most important military commanders in France from circulation. Turenne's path into the Fronde was more personal, and by his own later admission, less defensible. His brother, the Duc de Bouillon, opposed Mazarin. Condé's sister, the Duchess de Longueville, was a woman toward whom Turenne had feelings that his biographers have treated with varying degrees of delicacy for 4 centuries. Under the combined pressure of family obligation and something that looked considerably like romantic infatuation, Turenne joined the anti-Mazarin faction, fled to the Netherlands when Mazarin had him removed from command, and then fought against the royal armies in the second phase of the Fronde. His own troops, the army of Weimar, refused to follow him into rebellion. He spent months in a military and political limbo that he would spend years afterward not discussing. What changed everything was Condé's release from prison in early 1651, an act of the Regency Council that solved one problem and immediately created another. Condé, upon his release, did not reconcile with Mazarin. He raised an army in the south of France and made war on the royal family directly, a decision that crossed a line that even the most disgruntled French noble had been reluctant to cross, because making war on one's own king was not rebellion, but treason, and the distinction mattered both legally and morally. Turenne, confronted with the choice of following Condé into outright treason or returning to royal service, returned to royal service, took command of the king's armies, and began the campaign that would occupy the next several years of his life, hunting Condé. The personal dimension of what followed is not incidental. These were men who had fought alongside each other through the 30 Years' War, who had developed the kind of mutual professional respect that comes from watching someone perform under pressure and recognizing genuine ability. Now they were trying to destroy each other with those same armies, using the same methods, on the same ground, with both of them knowing exactly how the other man thought. The campaigns between Turenne and Condé from 1651 to 1653 constitute one of the most technically demanding series of engagements in 17th century European warfare, and historians of military art have spent 4 centuries studying them precisely because the two men were so evenly matched that their confrontations reveal, with unusual clarity, the difference between their approaches to command. Condé attacked. This was not recklessness. His attacks were calibrated, his timing often brilliant, but his instinct was always to find the moment of maximum advantage and strike before it passed. He had been doing this since Rocroi, and it had made him the most celebrated battlefield commander in Europe. At Blenheim in April 1652, he caught Turenne's colleague, Marshal d'Auconcourt, with his force divided and destroyed it so quickly that Turenne barely had time to arrive and salvage the situation. The speed of the attack and the precision of the execution were characteristic. Condé had identified a window of vulnerability and moved through it before anyone could close it. Turenne managed. This was not passivity. He was personally brave, physically present in the fighting, repeatedly cited for courage under fire. But his temperament was to construct situations rather than exploit moments, to maneuver his enemy into disadvantageous ground, and then force the engagement on his own terms. His strength was patience, and the willingness to accept tactical inconclusion in pursuit of strategic result. Where Condé saw the battle that could be won today, Turenne saw the campaign that could be won next month. The confrontation that most clearly illustrated the difference came in July 1652 at the Faubourg Saint-Antoine on the outskirts of Paris. Turenne had maneuvered Condé's army against the city walls, cutting off his retreat and forcing him to fight in a position where the buildings of the Faubourg offered some defensive cover but no real escape. Condé attacked with characteristic ferocity, his cavalry charging repeatedly against Turenne's lines, buying time and space for his infantry with a personal recklessness that left his horse shot out from under him. He was trapped. Turenne's army was larger, his position stronger, and time was on his side. Condé was saved by a woman, Anne-Marie Louise d'Orléans, the Duchess de Montpensier, first cousin to Louis XIV himself, one of the wealthiest women in France, known to history as La Grande Mademoiselle, ordered the gates of Paris opened, and then from the walls of the Bastille turned the fortress's cannon on Turenne's army to cover Condé's retreat into the city. It was an extraordinary intervention, improvised, politically catastrophic for the Duchess herself. Louis XIV banished her from court for 5 years as punishment, and militarily decisive. Condé lived, his army survived, the war continued, but the intervention had revealed something important. Condé's survival increasingly depended on factors outside his control. He had been a better tactician at Blenheim, but Turenne had positioned him against the Paris walls through superior campaign management. The cannon of the Bastille, not military genius, had kept him alive at Saint-Antoine. Condé understood this. He was not a man given to self-deception about military situations. When Paris fell to the Royalists later that summer, and Condé could no longer hold a position in France, he made the only decision available to him. He crossed into the Spanish Netherlands and offered his sword to Philip IV of Spain, who was delighted to have France's greatest general and gave him command of his main army in the field. For the next 5 years, Turenne and Condé faced each other across the border between France and the Spanish Netherlands, each commanding the armies of his respective employer, each too skilled to let the other win decisively, and too constrained by resources and politics to press a permanent advantage. The campaigns of 1653 through 1657 were a masterclass in strategic deadlock produced by two men who understood each other's methods thoroughly and could anticipate each other's moves with a precision that made bold strokes genuinely dangerous. Turenne in 1653 captured Rethel, Saint-Menehould, and Mouzon in rapid succession, moving faster than Condé and the Spanish could respond. Condé in 1654 forced Turenne into a defensive position by besieging Arras, which Turenne could not afford to let fall because its loss would open the road to Paris. At Arras, Turenne attacked the Spanish siege works with an army half the size of the besieging force, 14,000 against 25,000, because he had analyzed the Spanish positions and concluded that their extended perimeter had weak points, that their command structure would not respond quickly to a crisis, and that speed and surprise could substitute for numbers if everything was precisely coordinated. His assault broke the Spanish lines and relieved Arras in a single night engagement that contemporaries ranked among the most technically accomplished operations of the entire war. The Spanish never quite recovered their confidence in the northern theater after Arras. At Valenciennes in 1656, the roles were reversed. Condé identified a vulnerability in Turenne's siege lines and attacked through it with enough force and speed to win the battle before Turenne could reorganize his troops. The French lost several thousand men and were pushed back from the city. Each victory revealed the same thing. When either man could control the terms of the engagement, could choose the ground, the timing, the pace, he was likely to win. The problem was that they were too evenly matched for either to consistently control those terms. The border moved back and forth, cities changed hands and changed back. The war ground on. What finally broke the deadlock was not a military development, but a political one. In 1657, Cardinal Mazarin concluded an alliance with Oliver Cromwell's England. The terms were specific and practical. France would receive 6,000 English infantry veterans of the new model army, the most experienced and disciplined soldiers in Europe, plus an English fleet to operate in the Channel. In return, England would receive Dunkirk once it was captured. Cromwell needed Dunkirk to protect English merchant shipping from the Spanish privateers, who had been systematically devastating it. Mazarin needed the English infantry to give Turenne the decisive numerical advantage that years of maneuvering had failed to produce. The 6,000 English soldiers who arrived in France in 1658 were veterans of a civil war that had transformed European infantry tactics. They were trained to advance under fire, to use their muskets aggressively rather than defensively, and to press attacks against fortified positions that continental infantry of the same period would have been far more cautious about. Their presence transformed Turenne's tactical options because it gave him a force capable of direct assault against prepared positions, the kind of attack that required men willing to take heavy casualties to achieve a result, and that Condé had consistently used because his cavalry was the best in Europe and he was willing to spend it. In May 1658, Turenne besieged Dunkirk with an army of approximately 20,000 men, French regulars, the Swiss Guard, the English contingent, and an English fleet of 18 ships blockading the port from the sea. The Spanish garrison of 3,000 could not be resupplied or reinforced by water, and the land approaches were covered by the French army. The fall of Dunkirk was a matter of time. Don Juan José of Austria, commanding the Spanish forces in the Netherlands, assembled a relief army of approximately 15,000 men and marched to Dunkirk's relief. His force included the Spanish tercios, Walloon, and German regiments, 2,000 English and Irish royalists under James, Duke of York, and on the left wing, the French Frondeur contingent under Condé. Juan José had more cavalry than Turenne, and his infantry were experienced, but he had moved too quickly and left his artillery behind rather than delay the march, a decision that would have severe consequences on terrain where artillery was critical. Turenne received news of the Spanish approach on June 13th and made the decision that defined his generalship. Rather than remain in his siege lines and allow the Spanish to choose their moment of attack, he left a detachment to continue the siege and advanced with his main force to meet Juan José before the garrison could coordinate with the relief army. He chose his battlefield carefully, and the choice was everything. The dunes north of Dunkirk ran perpendicular to the sea, rising to 150 feet at their highest point, and creating a series of ridges and hollows that channeled movement into predictable corridors. Juan José positioned his army with his right wing on the beach, where the dunes met the water, and his left extending inland toward the Canal of Furness. The position was defensively strong if it could be held on all fronts simultaneously. It could not be held on all fronts simultaneously because Turenne had noticed something the Spanish had apparently not considered with sufficient care. The tide was going out. On the morning of June 14th, as the English veterans and redcoats advanced against the Spanish right, Turenne sent his cavalry along the strip of firm, wet sand that the receding tide had exposed between the dunes and the water. There was no equivalent position for the Spanish cavalry to counter this move. They were above, on the soft sand of the dunes, where horses could not maneuver effectively. The English fleet, anchored offshore, added cannon fire to the pressure on the Spanish right. Within an hour, the Spanish right wing was collapsing under assault from the English infantry above on the dunes and from French cavalry below on the beach, with artillery from the sea adding to the chaos. Condé, on the Spanish left, was fighting a different battle. He knew what was happening on the right. He could see the collapse beginning. He charged anyway, leading his cavalry in 3 successive attacks against the French forces opposing him, not because he believed he could win, but because the only service left available to him was to cover the Spanish retreat and prevent the rout from becoming a complete annihilation. His attacks were conducted with the same ferocious personal courage he had shown at Rocroi 15 years earlier, now in the service of a battle he had already lost. The French corps he was fighting pulled back rather than break, unwilling to take the casualties that defeating Condé's charges would have required. The battle lasted 2 hours. Spanish losses were approximately 6,000, of whom 4,000 were captured. French and English losses were around 400, the majority English. The Dunkirk garrison surrendered shortly afterward, and the port was handed to England as agreed. Within the year, Spain and France negotiated the Treaty of the Pyrenees, ending 24 years of war. The peace was sealed by the marriage of Louis XIV to Maria Theresa of Spain, a dynastic solution that made Mazarin the architect of the settlement he had spent his career pursuing, and that confirmed France as the dominant power in Western Europe. Louis XIV pardoned Condé in 1660, 2 years after the Dunes, in what was described officially as an act of royal clemency and was understood by everyone as a pragmatic recognition that France needed its best general. Condé returned to Paris, was restored to his rank and his estates, and spent the next 20 years commanding French armies again, often alongside Turenne, with whom the relationship had evolved into something that was neither the old comradeship nor the enmity of the Fronde years, but rather the mutual professional respect of 2 men who had spent a decade trying to destroy each other and had discovered in the process that neither could manage it. They fought together in the War of Devolution in 1667, when Louis XIV invaded the Spanish Netherlands and Turenne overran it with such speed that contemporary observers described the campaign as a military promenade, a testament to what French armies could accomplish when not fighting each other. They fought together again in the Dutch War of 1672, when French armies crossed the Rhine and pushed as far as Amsterdam, before the Dutch opened their dikes and flooded the country. Condé led cavalry. Turenne managed the strategic framework. The methods that had looked like fundamental opposition during the Fronde turned out, when directed at the same enemy, to be profoundly complementary. Turenne was killed at Sasse-Bach in July 1675, struck by a cannonball while reconnoitering positions for the following day's battle. He was 63 years old and had been at war, almost continuously, since he was 18. Louis XIV ordered him buried in the Royal Abbey of Saint-Denis, alongside the kings of France, an honor without precedent for a subject, and a measure of how completely the king understood what he had lost. Napoleon had Turenne's remains transferred to Les Invalides in 1800, ranking him among the greatest commanders in history, in language that was, coming from Napoleon, as close to professional admiration as the man ever expressed. Condé retired from active command in 1675, the same year Turenne died, and spent the last 11 years of his life at Chantilly, his estate north of Paris, hosting the most distinguished literary and intellectual salon in France. Molière performed there. Racine dedicated plays to him. La Fontaine wrote fables in his honor. The man who had broken the Spanish tercios at Rocroi and charged 3 times against Turenne's cavalry at the Dunes sat in his gardens and listened to poetry. He died in 1686 at 64. What the decade of their opposition produced was not the victory of one method over another, or one man over another, but something more ambiguous and more consequential. The Fronde had been, at its core, a question about whether France would be governed by its great nobles or by its king. Condé had fought on the noble side and lost, not because his generalship was inferior. At the level of the individual battle, he was Turenne's equal or better, but because the political situation had shifted against him in ways that military genius could not compensate for. The pardoned Condé, who returned to Paris in 1660, returned to a France where that question had been settled, where the king's authority was not seriously contested, where the role of the great nobility was to serve rather than to govern. Louis XIV built Versailles to keep his nobles close, visible, manageable. The architecture of absolutism was designed partly by the experience of the Fronde, partly by the lesson that Turenne and Condé had taught the monarchy about how much damage two great commanders could do when fighting each other rather than the king's enemies. The Fronde had cost France 10 years, several 100,000 casualties across its various conflicts, and a generation of internal devastation that contemporary observers compared to the worst years of the 30 Years' War. It had been resolved not by the military defeat of one side — Condé was never militarily beaten, only politically isolated — but by the gradual exhaustion of the political conditions that had made the rebellion possible, combined with Turenne's superior judgment about which side he wanted to be on when those conditions changed. This was perhaps the most fundamental difference between them, and it had nothing to do with tactics.